What if the long, simmering Cold War between the United States and Iran finally boiled over? I mean, really exploded into open conflict. It's the kind of question that keeps military planners and world leaders up at night. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through a really detailed hypothetical scenario, one that's based on a ton of analysis of what that war could actually look like, from the very first shot to the devastating aftermath.
So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's March 2026. A classified folder lands on the president's desk in the Oval Office. Inside, you've got satellite photos, intercepted messages, even testimony from a high-level defector. And the conclusion is absolutely chilling and unavoidable. Iran is building a nuclear bomb.
At this point, all the diplomatic off-ramps have been closed. International inspectors, they've been kicked out. The world is basically holding its breath, asking the one question that matters more than any other. What happens next?
But, you know, a crisis like this doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's really the final, catastrophic crack in a foundation that's been crumbling for decades. So to really understand the War of 2026, we first have to go back and walk the long, tense path that led us there.
Okay, so this whole standoff really explodes into public view back in 2002 when secret nuclear sites are discovered. That kicks off years of sanctions and tense negotiations, which eventually leads to that big 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which put the program on ice, at least for a while. But then, in 2018, the US pulls out, and the whole thing just falls apart. Fast forward to 2025, and Iran is officially a threshold nuclear state. That means they have all the ingredients they need for a bomb. They just have to make the final decision to, well, bake the cake.
Now, Iran knows it can't go toe-to-toe with the US military in a conventional fight. That would be suicide. So instead, they got smart. They built what's called an asymmetric arsenal. You shouldn't think of it as a single army, but more like a web of allied militias and proxy forces stretched all across the Middle East. This gives them the power to strike US and allied interests from a dozen different directions at once, all with plausible deniability. This network, it's their ultimate insurance policy.
And that brings us right back to 2026. The intelligence is confirmed. Diplomacy is officially dead. The decision is made. And the spark is about to ignite a fire that will engulf the entire region. Welcome to Week 1.
Under the cover of darkness, Operation Resolute Sentinel kicks off. And let me be clear, this isn't some small surgical strike. This is a massive, overwhelming wave of force. We're talking cruise missiles launched from submarines in the Gulf, flying in coordination with B-2 stealth bombers that have flown halfway around the world. They all hit their targets across Iran at the exact same moment. The goal? To completely decapitate Iran's nuclear program in a single night.
The response from Tehran? It's immediate, and it is furious. Within just a few hours, Supreme Leader Khamenei is on state television, and his message isn't about peace talks or de-escalation. Nope. It is a promise of crushing revenge.
The first shockwave to hit the globe isn't military, it's economic. Iran immediately goes for the world's oil jugular, the Strait of Hormuz. Revolutionary Guard speedboats and naval mines start targeting oil tankers, and the effect is instantaneous. The price of oil almost doubles in just 48 hours, sending an absolute panic through the entire global economy.
And that panic on the oil markets? It hits Wall Street like a tidal wave. The Dow Jones plummets 2,400 points in a single day. Suddenly, this isn't just some faraway conflict anymore. It's a full-blown global economic crisis, and we're only 2 days in. And then, Iran's asymmetric arsenal, that whole proxy network we talked about, is fully activated. It's like flipping a switch. In Lebanon, Hezbollah unleashes a barrage of rockets into Israel. In Iraq, militias swarm US bases. In Yemen, the Houthis start firing missiles at container ships. And then Iran itself launches its own ballistic missiles at American bases in the Gulf. What started as a limited strike has just exploded into a multi-front regional war.
The first week is just this whirlwind of shock and awe. But what happens when the dust starts to settle? Well, the conflict enters a new and frankly much more brutal phase. It becomes painfully clear there is no easy path to victory for anyone. This is the unwinnable stalemate. Okay, so here's the central problem of this whole war. The US objective is to destroy stuff, to break enough of Iran's military and nuclear sites to force them to surrender. But Iran's objective is way simpler. Just survive.
They don't have to win, they just have to make the war so costly, so bloody, and so politically painful that America eventually gives up and goes home. And these two completely opposing goals create a stalemate with no obvious end in sight.
So, what's the rest of the world doing while all this is happening? Well, the United States finds itself increasingly isolated. At the UN Security Council, any action is immediately vetoed by Russia and China. America's allies in Europe, they're divided and deeply concerned, offering very limited support. Meanwhile, rivals like China and Russia are more than happy to publicly condemn the US while quietly using the crisis to their own advantage.
With no quick victory on the horizon, the war just evolves into this horrific, grinding war of attrition. The US controls the skies with a punishing air campaign, but on the ground and at sea, Iran keeps inflicting pain with mines, suicide drones, and sleeper cell attacks. The fighting between Israel and Hezbollah becomes its own separate, devastating war. And underneath all of this, a massive humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding across the entire region.
After months and months of this brutal stalemate, the end doesn't come through victory, but through pure mutual exhaustion. Both sides are battered, they're bleeding, and they are desperate for a way out. So let's take a look at the devastating aftermath of this conflict. So, 1 year after it all began, the fighting finally stops. In February 2027, American and Iranian diplomats sign a fragile peace deal. But let's be clear, there are no victory parades for anyone. This is a peace born of desperation, signed by two exhausted countries that have inflicted terrible wounds on each other and on the rest of the world. So what was the final bill for the United States? The numbers are just staggering. Almost $400 billion in direct financial costs. Over 800 American service members killed, with thousands more wounded. But honestly, the real costs go way beyond the numbers. The war leaves a deeply divided country at home and a serious loss of trust with key allies abroad. The war is over, but the Middle East has been completely reshaped. Iran's regime, against all the odds, actually survives, though it's much weaker. Other countries in the region, like Israel and Saudi Arabia, learn a hard lesson. They can't rely only on the US for their security. And America, burned by another long, costly war, speeds up its withdrawal from the region. But the most unsettling fact of all, you can't bomb away knowledge. Iran still knows how to build a bomb, creating this tense, uneasy new cold peace.
So, after walking through that absolutely devastating scenario, what's the big takeaway here? What are the key lessons we can pull from this terrifying glimpse over the brink of all-out war?
Well, 5 really crucial lessons stand out. First, military power can win you battles, for sure, but it can't always get you the political victory you want. Second, in our world today, there's no such thing as a regional conflict. The ripples always go global. Third, asymmetric warfare is a game changer. It lets a smaller power fight a superpower to a bloody draw. 4, everyone pays the price, whether it's at the gas station or the grocery store. And the last lesson, probably the most important one, starting a war is always easier than ending one.
And that leaves us with our final and most critical question. This entire scenario, as realistic as we've tried to make it, is still fiction. It's an analysis of what could happen. The real question it forces us to ask is this: knowing the absolutely catastrophic costs, what will it take to make sure this story stays on the page and never, ever becomes our reality?
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are stepping into a future that feels uncomfortably close. We're analyzing a comprehensive scenario-based projection of a conflict between the United States and Iran, starting in March 2026. This isn't just a military war game, it's a 20-year projection covering the lead-up, the war itself, and the geopolitical shockwaves that follow.
And it is a terrifying read. It's titled Scenario 2026, but it really reads like a history of the future that went wrong. It tracks how a localized strike to stop a nuclear bomb just spirals into something that reshapes the entire global order.
It certainly reshapes things, but the core question we have to wrestle with is whether that reshaping was necessary. The scenario posits a world where diplomacy has collapsed, Iran is sprinting toward a nuclear weapon. The question is, does this projection demonstrate that military intervention, costly, bloody, and difficult, is the only tool left? I look at this document and, well, I see a hard truth. Decisive action, triggered by a clear red line, effectively degraded an existential threat.
See, I see the exact opposite. To me, this document is the ultimate cautionary tale. It illustrates the paradox of modern warfare. You can win the tactical battle, destroy the buildings, hit the targets, and simultaneously suffer a catastrophic strategic defeat. My argument is that the scenario proves the cure was worse than the disease. The humanitarian toll, the economic collapse, and the isolation of the United States, it just outweighs any delay in their nuclear program.
I think that's where we fundamentally disagree on the value of non-proliferation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to set the stage. The scenario begins in March 2026. The world is already on edge.
Right, the trigger phase.
The context here is vital. We aren't talking about a sudden, unprovoked attack by the US. The scenario details a series of escalations. A US drone is shot down over international waters. Then, tragically, a rocket attack on a base in Iraq kills 15 American contractors. But the real smoking gun in the text is the intelligence.
Credible evidence, they called it.
It was more than just the phrase. The scenario describes satellite imagery showing unusual heat signatures at covert assembly sites, and crucially, a high-level defector from the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who provided schematics for weaponization. The US administration was staring at a timeline of weeks, not years, before Iran possessed a functional nuclear device. When you combine a rush to a bomb with dead Americans on the ground, well, the diplomatic off-ramps just disappear.
That's the narrative the planners in the scenario bought into, yes. But we have the benefit of reading the full document, including the years 11 to 20 retrospective. And that retrospective drops a bombshell that you're glossing over. Post-war investigations reveal that the intelligence was, quote, significantly more ambiguous than it was presented in the Situation Room.
Intelligence is always a probability game, never a certainty.
But it mirrors the systemic failures of 2003 in Iraq, almost beat for beat. The scenario suggests that a small circle of advisors, pressured by regional allies who wanted the US to do their dirty work, they filtered out the dissenting voices in the intelligence community. They effectively cherry-picked the defectors' testimony to justify a war they already wanted to fight. So we started a global conflict based on a maybe.
Even if we accept some ambiguity, the threat perception was real. And once the decision was made, the execution, Operation Resolute Sentinel, was undeniably effective. I want to look at the first week described in the text. This wasn't a reckless carpet bombing. It was a masterclass in precision.
It was certainly violent.
It was efficient. The scenario details a coordinated strike using over 200 Tomahawk cruise missiles, and critically, the B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. They targeted Natanz, Arak, and the deeply buried Fordow facility. The B-2s did exactly what they were designed to do: penetrate sophisticated air defenses and destroy hardened targets that were, previously thought to be immune to attack. By week 4, the US had total air supremacy.
You say total air supremacy like it's a video game score. Let's talk about what happened on the ground while the US was winning in the sky. The text describes an F-16 pilot shot down over hostile territory. He wasn't just lost, he was captured and paraded on state television. That image alone galvanized the Iranian public.
A tragic loss, absolutely.
And it wasn't just the pilot. You mentioned precision. The scenario highlights a Tomahawk missile that malfunctioned and struck a residential complex in Isfahan. 23 civilians killed, including children. The footage of that scene was broadcast globally within minutes. That is the reality of kinetic warfare, a sterile term for blowing things up. You can have 99% accuracy, but that 1% failure loses you the moral high ground instantly. The text says protest erupted from Jakarta to Caracas. The US looked like a bully, not a savior.
I'm not dismissing the tragedy of civilian casualties. It is horrific, but we have to weigh that against the potential casualties of a nuclear exchange in the Middle East. The strike successfully set the Iranian nuclear program back by a decade. That is a tangible security achievement. However, I will concede that the Iranian response was more robust than planners anticipated.
Robust is an understatement. This is where the scenario introduces the concept of the distributed nervous system.
Their proxy network.
Exactly. For our listeners, think of it this way. The US cut off the head of the snake in Tehran by bombing the facilities, but the snake has venomous limbs all over the region that operate independently. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, they all activated simultaneously.
It was a massive escalation. I agree.
It was asymmetric warfare at its most terrifying. Asymmetric just means the weaker side using unconventional tactics to hurt the stronger side where they're vulnerable. We saw thousands of rockets raining down on Israel, forcing air raid sirens in Tel Aviv for weeks. We saw the Houthis targeting Saudi oil infrastructure.
But let's look at the defense. The scenario notes that U.S. Patriot and THAAD batteries performed exceptionally well. They intercepted the vast majority of ballistic missiles aimed at the UAE and Qatar. The defensive umbrella held.
A shield is never perfect. One missile got through to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. 31 Americans died. But the real turning point, the moment where the U.S. calculation really fell apart, was the Week 3 event in Bahrain.
The suicide attack?
Yes. Iranian special forces, utilizing local networks, managed to get suicide bombers to the perimeter of the U.S. naval base. 47 American sailors killed in an instant. This is what I mean by the failure of air supremacy. You can own the skies, but you cannot stop a human being with a bomb and a grudge. The text compares the psychological impact to the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. It shattered the American public's resolve.
It was a gut-wrenching moment. But I interpret that attack differently. The scenario describes the Iranian regime as being backed into a corner. They were lashing out because their conventional military, their tanks, their air force, their command and control had been obliterated by U.S. air power. They were desperate. And despite the horror of Bahrain, the U.S. didn't cut and run. They intensified the pressure.
They intensified the misery, you mean?
I mean, they applied leverage. This brings us to the economic dimension, the months 2-6 phase. The U.S. enforced a strict naval blockade.
And the consequences were global. This is the part of the scenario that really hits home for anyone listening who worries about their 401k or the price of gas. The moment the shooting started, the Strait of Hormuz became a no-go zone. Swarm attacks by Iranian speedboats made shipping uninsurable.
The U.S. Navy eventually cleared those lanes. Eventually. But in the meantime, oil went from $89 to $154 a barrel. The Dow Jones plunged 2,400 points in a single day. Think about what that does to pension funds, to liquidity, to consumer confidence. The scenario describes a global recession triggered almost overnight. Inflation in the U.S. hit 9% again. Gas was $5.50 a gallon. War is expensive. Freedom is expensive. But who paid the price? The text describes the humanitarian situation inside Iran as catastrophic. We're talking about a breakdown of the medical supply chain, insulin, antibiotics, cancer treatments, they stopped coming in. The scenario explicitly mentions malnutrition rising in urban centers.
And that economic pain, as harsh as it sounds, is what broke the deadlock. The scenario states that by late 2026, Iran's GDP had contracted by 35%. The hardliners in the regime wanted to keep fighting, to turn the country into a fortress of martyrdom, but the pragmatist factions, the business elites, the quieter voices in the government, realized the state was collapsing. The blockade empowered them to push for a ceasefire.
I disagree with your reading there. The text says that for the first 6 months, the population rallied around the flag. When you starve a population, they don't blame their government. They blame the people blocking the ships. It entrenched the regime's narrative that the West was out to destroy them. The only reason they came to the table was because the country was physically ceasing to function, not because they had a change of heart.
But they did come to the table. That's the key. February 2027, the interim agreement on regional security signed in Oman.
A piece of paper signed on top of a pile of ashes.
It was more than a piece of paper. It included verified dismantlement of the nuclear program. International inspectors were back in. The scenario is clear. The nuclear threat was neutralized. Diplomacy had failed for years prior to the war. It only worked after the military shattered Iran's leverage. That validates the intervention. The objective was no Iranian bomb, and the result was no Iranian bomb.
But we have to look at the aftermath section, years 2 through 10. This is where the argument for success really unravels for me. The U.S. achieved its specific goal, sure, but it lost the world in the process.
Lost the world is a bit dramatic.
Is it? The scenario details a complete geopolitical realignment. It calls it the acceleration of multipolarity. For listeners who aren't policy wonks, that basically means the end of the era where the U.S. is the only superpower that matters. While the U.S. was bogged down destroying Iranian centrifuges,
Russia and China had a field day.
Great power competition was happening anyway.
But this poured gasoline on it. The text says China stepped in as the peacemaker and the economic savior of the global South, pointing to the U.S. as an unstable aggressor. Russia used the distraction to solidify its influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The UN General Assembly voted 98-31 to condemn the U.S. action. We were isolated. We were the pariahs.
Isolation is temporary. A nuclear weapon is permanent. Plus, the scenario notes that Iran's proxy networks were significantly diminished. Hezbollah and the Houthis were starved of funds because Iran's economy was operating at, 70% capacity? The region entered a cold peace. It wasn't friendly, but it was stable. The Gulf states finally stepped up their own defenses instead of just relying on Washington.
A cold peace, maybe. But let's talk about the domestic cost in the U.S. The scenario mentions the militarization of cyberspace.
That is a critical point.
During the war, Iranian hackers and likely freelancers supported by other powers attacked U.S. financial grids and power networks. It wasn't Armageddon, but it caused brownouts and banking freezes. The text says this became the new normal. The war lowered the bar. Now, every conflict involves turning off the lights in your enemy's civilian homes. We traded a potential nuclear threat for permanent vulnerability in our own infrastructure.
I admit the cyber dimension is the most concerning part of the long-term analysis. It suggests that the battlefield has no borders anymore. But I keep coming back to the alternative. The scenario mentions a counterfactual analysis, asking what would have happened without the war.
Yes, and that's the most heartbreaking part. The counterfactual suggests that the intelligence was wrong about the timeline. Iran was having technical difficulties. Diplomacy, had it been given another year, might have achieved a containment deal without firing a shot.
Or they would have used that year to cross the finish line, and we would be facing a nuclear-armed regime threatening Tel Aviv or Riyadh with annihilation. That is the gamble. The scenario shows that the U.S. chose the certainty of war over the risk of inaction, and by 2035, the region was nuclear-free.
But at what cost to the American soul? The text mentions the veterans of this conflict, a generation dealing with the moral injury of a war that ended with the enemy regime still in power. The Ayatollahs didn't fall, they survived. So the soldiers ask, what did my friends die for? The scenario says that by 2045, historians view this war as a strategic mistake that accelerated American decline.
Historians can debate in safety because soldiers remove the existential threat. That's the burden of leadership. You make the ugly choice to prevent the catastrophic one. The scenario outlines $400 billion spent and hundreds of lives lost. That is a tragedy. But a nuclear exchange is an apocalypse. The uneasy equilibrium described in the 2030s is, in my view, a victory, however messy it looks.
And I look at the same text and see a tragedy of errors. We smashed a country, broke the global economy, and isolated ourselves, all to stop a weapon that might not have been built based on intelligence that was ambiguous at best. It proved that in the 21st century, there is no such thing as a surgical strike. You cut the patient and the infection spreads everywhere.
It is a scenario that leaves you with no easy answers. It forces us to confront the limits of our power and the terrible price of security.
Absolutely. It demands that we look past the initial victory of the first week and stare into the decades of consequences that follow.
We hope this deep dive helps you understand the gravity of these potential decisions. We encourage you to read the full scenario and the counterfactuals yourself.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining the debate.